In this video, we'll cover Section 2.1, Properties of Parallel Lines. First, let's review the term transversal. A transversal is a line that intersects two coplanar lines at two distinct points. So in the example below, line T is an example of a transversal. So we could say that transversal T intersects lines L and M. Now, the first type of angle pair we have are corresponding angles. So corresponding angles are angles that are on the same side of the transversal in corresponding positions. So if I highlight my two parallel lines of M and N and my transversal T, my corresponding angles are the ones that are in kind of like the same spot in relation. So if I have the upper left of both of these, angle 1 and angle 5 are corresponding because they're in the same location. Then I also have angle 2 and angle 6 are corresponding because they're both in the upper right. So angle 2 and angle 6. You also have angle 3 and angle 7 are corresponding because they're both in the lower right. And then lastly, you also could have angle 4 and angle 8 because they're both in the bottom left. For the next definition for alternate interior angles are angles that are interior angles and on opposite sides of the transversal. So if I highlight my parallel lines of M and N and my transversal T, we want the angles that are on opposite sides of that yellow line and between the black lines. So for example, angle 4 and angle 6 are on opposite sides of the lines and between the parallel lines. So that's one example. And you also could have angle 3 and angle 5 because they're between the parallel lines and on opposite sides. For the next pair of angles, we have alternate exterior angles. Alternate exterior angles are non-adjacent exterior angles that are on opposite sides of the transversal. So if I highlight my parallel lines of M and N and I go over my transversal in yellow, the alternate exterior angles are outside the lines and on opposite sides. So I could have angle 1 and angle 7 are outside the parallel lines and on opposite sides of that yellow line, making them alternate exterior angles. So I could have angle 1 and angle 7. And then you also could have angle 2 and angle 8 because they're on opposite sides of the transversal and outside the parallel lines. For the next pair of angles, we have same side interior angles, and those are angles that are on the same side of the transversal and are between the lines. So if I were to highlight my parallel lines of M and N, and I highlight my transversal in yellow, an example of same side interior angles could be angle 3 and angle 6 because they're on the same side of the yellow line and are between the lines. And you also could have angle 5 and angle 4 because they're between the parallel lines and on the same side of the transversal. So angle 4 and angle 5. And the last example we have for same side exterior angles, those are angles on the same side of the transversal and are outside the lines. So if I highlight my parallel lines of M and N, and I go over my transversal in the yellow highlight, an example of same side exterior angles would be angle 1 and angle 8 because they're on the same side of the transversal and are outside the parallel lines. And you also could have angle 2 and angle 7 because they're on the same side of that transversal and are outside the parallel lines. Now, when you're classifying angle pairs, there's essentially 3 questions you want to ask yourself. First, you want to say, are the angles corresponding? If your answer is yes, then you're going to stop and that's your classification. If not, then you're going to continue to the next question. Okay. And our next question says, are the angles alternate or same side? And then lastly, are they interior, exterior? And that will help us to develop our final conclusion. Next, let's review the relationships associated with these angles. So first, the corresponding angles postulate tells us that if a transversal intersects two parallel lines, then the corresponding angles are congruent. So for example, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So we could show in the example, angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent, and we could do the same with any pair of corresponding angles. Next, for the alternate interior angles theorem, says that if a transversal intersects two parallel lines, then the alternate interior angles are congruent. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. So for example, angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent. Then for alternate exterior angles, it says if a transversal intersects two parallel lines, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. So angle 1 would be congruent to angle 3 as well. So I can mark angle 1 and angle 3 as congruent. And then for our last two relationships, for same side interior angles, it says if a transversal intersects two parallel lines, then the same side interior angles are supplementary. So the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180. So I have this angle plus this angle should add to equal 180. And then for the same side exterior angles, it says if a transversal intersects two parallel lines, then the same side exterior angles are supplementary. So angle 2 and angle 3 adds 180. So if I were to mark that, I have angle 2 and angle 3, and again, these two should add to equal 180. Now to summarize the relationships, the angle pairs that are congruent are corresponding angles, alternate interior angles, and alternate exterior angles. And the angle pairs that are supplementary are same side interior angles and same side exterior angles. What we should notice is that same side interior angles and same side exterior angles and supplementary all start with an S, so if it starts with an S, they're supplementary. Otherwise, we do have the relationship that works for corresponding with congruent, however, it doesn't work with alternate interiors. The best way to remember is if it starts with an S, then they're supplementary. The other important thing to note is that these relationships are only true if the lines are parallel. If the lines are not parallel, then this does not apply. Now let's apply these relationships to solve for missing angle measures. The first thing we always need to do is identify the relationship between the angles. So if I look at these two as being my parallel lines with the transversal, we notice that when I look at both of these angles, the 77 and the question mark are both in the bottom left corner, which means that they are corresponding angles. And we know from the relationship that corresponding angles, because they start with a C, are congruent. So since this angle is 77, I can assume that this angle is 77 as well. So your answer should be 77 degrees. For the next pair, I have, if I highlight my parallel lines, and I highlight my transversal in yellow, we know that looking at what we have, I have the question mark is one of my angles, and my other angle is this angle. Now these angles are not corresponding angles. However, what we can tell is that they are alternate because they're on opposite sides of the transversal, and they're exterior because they're outside the parallel lines. And alternate exterior angles have a relationship of being congruent. So since this angle is 78, I can assume that this angle is also 78. So your answer should be 78 degrees. Now, for the next example, we first want to focus on highlighting my parallel lines. So if I highlight, these are my two parallel lines, and I highlight my transversal in yellow. When I look at these two angles, what we should notice is I have one angle here, and my other angle is over here. Now these angles are not corresponding because one of them is bottom left and one is top left. Now if I want to classify if they're alternate or same side, these would be considered same side because they're both on the same side of the transversal, and they're interior because they're between the parallel lines. Now because we have that same side interior starts with the letter S, we can automatically assume that they are supplementary or they add to equal 180. So if I call this angle X, I know that I should have X plus 111 equals 180. And when I solve by subtracting that 111 from both sides, you should get that X is equal to 69 degrees. For the next example, I highlight my parallel lines in gray and my transversal in yellow. If I look at what I have for my angles, I have this angle over here and this angle of 96. Now these angles are not corresponding because one is bottom left and one's top right. So that means they're either alternate or same side. Because they're on opposite sides, I'm going to call them alternate. And then they're interior, exterior, and these would be interior because they're between the parallel lines, which means that they are congruent. So based on the fact that this angle is 96, I can assume that this angle over here is 96 as well. So your answer should be 96 degrees. For the last problem at the bottom, when I highlight my parallel lines and my transversal, if I identify the two angles I have this 78-degree angle and the question mark down here. Now, if I'm identifying the angles, first we can check that these angles are not corresponding because one is top left and one is bottom left. Then we have to say, okay, are they same side or alternate? And these would be same side because they're on the same side of the transversal. And then are they interior, exterior? And these angles would be exterior because they're outside the parallel lines. Now, because same side exterior starts with an S, we can assume that the angles are supplementary, so they should add to equal 180. So if I treat this angle as X, I should have 78 plus X equals 180. And then when I solve by subtracting 78 from both sides, I would get X equals 102 degrees. Now for the next examples, you're going to go through the same process. It just now involves setting up an equation to solve. So if I highlight, these are my two parallel lines with my transversal. And I have, this is one of my angles, and my other angle is this angle. Now these angles are not corresponding because one is lower right and one's upper right. So I have to check, okay, are they same side or alternate? And they're on the same side of the yellow line, so these would be same side. And they're considered interior because they're between the parallel lines. So these are same side interior, which because this starts with an S allows us to say that they are supplementary. So they add to equal 180. So I could say that the red angle of 6x plus 7 plus the blue angle of 16x minus 3 should add to equal 180. Now when I combine like terms, the 6 plus 16 gives me a value of 22x. The 7 minus 3 gives me a value of 4 equals 180. I subtract 4 from both sides, so I get 22x equals 176, and then divide both sides by 22, to get x equals 8. For the next example, if I identify my parallel lines and my transversal, I have one angle is the 105 and the other one is the 107 plus x. Now, since these are both up or left, I automatically know that these are corresponding angles. And because they're corresponding angles and they start with a C, we can assume that they are congruent. So I can set the red angle of 105 equal to the blue angle of 107 plus x. And now if I just finish solving, I would have to subtract 107 from both sides to get -2 is equal to x as your final answer. For the next example, I'm first going to identify my parallel lines and my transversal. And if I look at the two angles I'm dealing with, I have the 70 and the 81 plus x. Now these are not corresponding because one is lower right and one's upper left. So we have to say, are they alternate or same side? And these would be alternate because they're on opposite sides of transversal and they're between the parallel lines, so they're alternate interior. And alternate interior angles have the relationship of being congruent. So that allows us to say that the red angle of 70 is equal to the blue angle of 81 plus x. Now if I solve, I would just subtract the 81 from both sides to get -11 equals x as our final answer. Then for over here, if I have these two are my parallel lines and my transversal, if I highlight my two lines, so I have 135 as one of my angles and the 10x plus 15 is the other angle. These aren't corresponding because one is top right and one is bottom left. Then I'd say, are they alternate or same side? And these would be alternate because they're on opposite sides of that yellow line. And they're exterior because they're outside the parallel lines. And we know the alternate exterior angles are congruent. So this allows us to say that the 135 is equal to the 10x plus 15. Now to solve, I would subtract 15 from both sides. So I get 120 equals 10x. Divide both sides by 10 to get 12 is equal to x. In our last example, if I highlight my parallel lines and I highlight my transversal in yellow, if I look at the two angles, I have this 3x plus 55 and the x plus 10. Now these angles are not corresponding because one is upper left and one's bottom left. That means they're alternate or same side. Because they're on the same side of the yellow line, I'm going to call them same side. And they're interior exterior, and because they're outside the parallel lines, these would be considered same side exterior angles. Now because they start with an S, we can assume that they are supplementary, so they should add to equal 180. So that means that the red angle, or the 3x plus 55, plus the blue angle of x plus 10 should add to equal 180. Now if I simplify, the 3x and x becomes 4x, 55 and 10 becomes 65 equals 180. So I subtract 65 from both sides. So I'd have 4x equals 115. And then you divide both sides by 4. So you would get x equals 28.75 as your final answer.